The Ottoman Empire did not fall in a single battle, and it did not collapse under the weight of one invading army. It faded in silence, not on the battlefield, but in offices, not with cannon fire, but with signatures. Picture the scene. Dimly lit rooms in Istanbul, heavy curtains drawn against the afternoon sun, wooden desks scarred by decades of use, ledgers open, ink pens press to paper. Each stroke looks harmless. Each document promises relief, a loan to pay soldiers, a credit line to repair ports, funds to modernize railways and weapons, survival, written neatly in columns. But hidden between the lines is something far more dangerous, a future already sold. History prefers louder endings, rebellions, sieges, lost wars, maps shrinking year after year. Those images are easy to remember. They feel decisive. But this story opens with a colder claim. By the time borders began to collapse, the Ottoman Empire was already financially hollow. The real damage had been done long before armies marched in. Debt did the work quietly, slowly, permanently. Loans arrived dressed as progress. They spoke the language of reform, efficiency, and modernization. They promised to pull the empire into a new age. Each agreement bought time. Each signature delayed disaster. But each one also tightened a grip that could not be seen. Think about that. An empire that once commanded trade between continents, now negotiating its survival one loan at a time. The Ottoman state needed money not to grow, but to breathe. Soldiers had to be paid. Cities had to be fed. Borders had to be defended. Without cash, the system would seize up in weeks. Tax collection lagged. Trade revenues fluctuated. Wars drained resources faster than they could be replaced. Borrowing became unavoidable. And once borrowing became normal, dependence followed close behind. At first, the loans felt manageable. Small concessions, reasonable interest, temporary solutions. Officials convinced themselves this was smart governance. Why collapse today when money could buy stability tomorrow? Railways would boost trade. Ports would increase customs revenue. Modern weapons would deter enemies. Everything seemed logical, rational, necessary. But debt has a way of changing the rules while pretending nothing has changed. Interest does not sleep. Repayment does not care about pride, tradition, or history. It only demands results. As years passed, repayment schedules grew heavier. Revenues were pledged in advance. Entire income streams were earmarked before they ever reached the treasury. Customs duties, state monopolies, taxes that once funded the empire now flowed outward. Control shifted quietly. No foreign flag needed to be raised. No occupation was required. Power moved through balance sheets instead of borders. The empire still looked sovereign on maps, but its choices were shrinking, and shrinking fast. Imagine ruling 3 continents, but needing approval to spend your own money. Imagine planning reforms while knowing that any surplus would be claimed by creditors first. That is the world the Ottoman leadership found itself in. Every crisis became harder to manage. Every decision carried financial consequences beyond domestic control. When drought struck or trade slowed, there was no buffer left. When unrest spread or enemies advanced, there was no emergency fund waiting. Debt had already claimed tomorrow. This is the central tension of the Ottoman collapse. Survival itself became conditional. Money was no longer a tool of policy. It was a leash. The empire could still mobilize troops, but it could not mobilize resources freely. It could announce reforms, but it could not fund them independently. Authority remained in name, but leverage had moved elsewhere. That shift is easy to miss in traditional histories, because it does not look dramatic. It looks administrative, boring, technical, but it is decisive. Consider how power usually changes hands in history. Through conquest, through revolution, through collapse that feels sudden and violent. The Ottoman story challenges that expectation. Here, power eroded before the fall. Sovereignty weakened before the defeat. The empire did not lose control because it was invaded. It was invaded because it had already lost control. Financial weakness invited political pressure. Political pressure invited intervention. The sequence matters. Debt also changed how time worked for the empire. Short-term survival became more important than long-term independence. Leaders were forced into trade-offs they could not escape. Pay today, promise tomorrow. Fix this year, sacrifice the next. The future became collateral. Once that mindset took hold, there was no easy way out. Raising taxes risked rebellion. Cutting spending weakened defense. Default threatened humiliation and retaliation. Every option carried pain. Borrowing simply delayed it. And delay can be seductive. It creates the illusion of control. As long as the state continued to function, the crisis felt distant. Palaces still stood. Ceremonies continued. Armies still marched. From the outside, the empire looked weakened but alive. From the inside, it was already negotiating with its own limits. The system ran not on strength, but on borrowed patience. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable, because debt did not arrive by force. It was invited, chosen, signed willingly under pressure. No empire believes it is trading away its future. It believes it is buying time. But time financed by others comes with conditions. And those conditions do not fade when the crisis passes. They compound. The Ottoman Empire faced a world that had changed faster than its institutions. Global finance had outpaced imperial tradition. Capital moved across borders with speed the empire could not match. Credit became a weapon more precise than artillery. Those who controlled money could shape outcomes without occupying territory. The Ottomans learned this lesson too late. By the time they understood the cost, escape was no longer possible. Ask the harder question. What happens when an empire's survival depends on access to credit rather than control of resources? What happens when policy is shaped not by strategy, but by repayment schedules? That is the question at the heart of this collapse. The answer is not dramatic. It is structural. Once dependence sets in, decline becomes predictable. This chapter does not end with explosions or surrender. It ends with an image far less cinematic, yet far more decisive. A ledger closing at the end of the day. Columns balanced. Obligations recorded. Interest calculated. Tomorrow already spoken for. The Ottoman collapse begins here, not with a battlefield lost, but with a future mortgaged. And once that ledger opened, it never truly closed. The story ahead follows that paper trail. Because empires do not always fall loudly. Sometimes they fade quietly, one agreement at a time, until power has gone long before the flag comes down. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire looked permanent, not strong in moments, but stable across generations. Its cities pulsed with trade and administration. Istanbul stood where continents met, a living hinge between Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Goods flowed through its markets from every direction. Spices, textiles, metals, grain. Ships crowded the harbors. Caravans stretched across roads that had been used for hundreds of years. Taxes moved upward through a vast bureaucracy that knew how to extract revenue from land and people alike. To the outside world, this did not look like a state on the edge. It looked like an old power adapting slowly, but surely. Even as Europe transformed, the Ottomans still controlled geography that could not be replaced. Sea lanes, mountain passes, religious centers, strategic choke points. These were assets that had carried the empire through previous centuries of change. When rivals rose, the Ottomans adjusted. When trade shifted, they taxed it. When threats emerged, they absorbed them. That history mattered, because it shaped how Ottoman leaders understood their position. Decline felt impossible. Weakness felt temporary. The empire had survived worse. From the outside, the signs supported that confidence. New reforms were announced. Ministries were reorganized. Uniformed soldiers drilled in public squares. Western-style schools opened their doors. Bureaucrats adopted new procedures. Palaces were renovated. The state looked busy, modern, active. There was movement everywhere. It created the impression of momentum. An empire in motion does not look like an empire in decline. But beneath the surface, the world was changing in ways that land and tradition could not counter. European powers were not just expanding territory. They were reorganizing their economies. Factories multiplied. Banks grew in size and influence. Capital markets matured. Money moved faster than goods, faster than armies. Control over credit began to matter more than control over territory. Power shifted from who owned land to who financed growth. The Ottoman system had been built for a different era. It excelled at extracting steady revenue from agriculture and trade. It worked well when economies moved slowly and borders stayed relatively fixed. But industrialization broke that rhythm. Costs rose faster than income. Military technology advanced quickly and demanded constant investment. Railways required upfront capital that traditional taxation could not easily supply. The empire faced expenses that arrived all at once, while revenue still arrived gradually. This gap created pressure, and pressure demanded solutions. Borrowing appeared logical. European lenders were eager. Capital was abundant. Interest seemed manageable. The deals were framed as partnerships, not takeovers. Funds would modernize the empire. In return, the empire would repay from future growth. Everyone appeared to benefit, at least on paper. Imagine the mindset inside the imperial administration. Officials were not reckless. They were pragmatic. They could see the world shifting. Railways were not optional. Modern ports were not luxuries. Armies equipped with outdated weapons could not survive. Doing nothing meant falling behind immediately. Borrowing meant keeping pace. And keeping pace meant staying relevant. So the empire borrowed to modernize, borrowed to reform, borrowed to protect its image as a great power. Rail lines stretched across territory, financed with foreign capital. Engineers arrived from abroad. Equipment followed. Contracts guaranteed returns using future revenue. It looked like progress. It felt like survival. But the balance was changing quietly. Because with every loan, the logic of the state shifted. Projects were no longer designed only around local needs. They were designed to satisfy creditors. Timelines mattered differently. Profitability mattered more. Revenue predictability became essential. Infrastructure began to serve financial flows as much as strategic ones. The empire was still ruling land, but its decisions were increasingly shaped by obligations tied to that land. The illusion of strength held because the system did not collapse immediately. On the contrary, borrowing often created a short-term boost. Construction meant jobs. Military spending meant activity. Government payments continued. The streets stayed busy. Markets stayed open. Stability seemed preserved. That visible continuity masked deeper weakness. From the outside, European observers still spoke of Ottoman reform. Newspapers reported modernization efforts. Diplomats attended ceremonies. The empire remained a fixture in international politics. This reinforced internal confidence. If the world still treated the empire as a power, then it must still be one. Appearances mattered, and the Ottomans were skilled at maintaining them. But internally, the financial structure was growing fragile. Debt service became a permanent line in the budget. Interest payments were no longer exceptional. They were routine. That alone changed priorities. Money that once funded administration or defense now went toward repayment. Each year began with obligations already fixed. Flexibility shrank. At the same time, European economies were accelerating. Industrial output expanded. Trade volumes grew. Financial institutions refined their leverage. The gap widened. What had once been a difference in pace became a difference in structure. European states could mobilize capital rapidly. The Ottoman state could not. It had to ask. This dependence reshaped relationships. Diplomacy was no longer just about alliances and borders. It was about confidence and creditworthiness. A state that needed loans could not afford to alienate lenders. Policy became cautious. Risk-taking declined. Independence softened. The most dangerous part was that none of this felt catastrophic yet. The empire still collected taxes, still fielded armies, still governed millions. Decline did not feel like collapse. It felt like management, like balancing pressures, like careful navigation. But strength on paper is not the same as strength in structure. The Ottomans still ruled territory, but they no longer controlled the financial systems that determined how that territory was used. Revenue was increasingly pre-committed. Growth was increasingly conditional. Decisions were increasingly constrained. Think about that shift. Power did not vanish overnight. It thinned, like metal stretched too far. The empire could still act, but not freely. Could still respond, but not decisively. Could still plan, but only within limits set elsewhere. The illusion of strength was reinforced by history itself. Empires do not expect to fall. They expect to endure. Every previous crisis had been met with adaptation. Why would this one be different? That belief was not foolish. It was inherited. It had worked before. But this time, the rules had changed. Control of money now meant control of outcomes. And the Ottoman Empire, for all its land and people, no longer controlled enough of its own money. The shift was subtle, almost polite, but it was real. By the end of this period, the empire stood in a strange position. Vast, visible, active, yet internally constrained. Its authority looked intact, but its freedom of action was narrowing. The machine still ran, but the fuel was borrowed. And borrowed fuel always comes with a bill. The illusion held just long enough to make the fall more painful. Because when the system finally cracked, it would not fail slowly. It would fail all at once. And the cause would not be obvious to those watching from the outside. That is where the story turns. Because once borrowing stopped being a temporary fix and became the foundation of survival, the empire crossed a line it could not uncross. The next chapter follows what happens when debt stops buying time and starts taking control. The real collapse did not begin when the Ottoman Empire borrowed money. It began when borrowing stopped being a choice and became a requirement. There is a critical difference between debt used as a bridge and debt used as a foundation. Bridges are crossed and left behind. Foundations lock a structure in place. By the time the empire reached this stage, loans were no longer temporary relief. They were structural. The state could not function without them. That was the moment debt stopped supporting power and started replacing it. Interest payments grew heavier each year. What had once been manageable obligations turned into permanent drains. Revenues arrived already spoken for. Customs duties, among the most reliable sources of income, were pledged in advance. Taxes collected from salt, tobacco, and other monopolies flowed directly toward repayment. These were not abstract numbers. These were the lifeblood of governance. Money that once paid officials maintained roads or funded defense now bypassed the treasury entirely. The state collected, but it did not control. When revenues fell short, the solution was no longer reform. It was refinancing. New loans were taken to service old ones. Debt paid debt. This is a trap. On paper, the empire remained solvent. In reality, it was treading water. Any disruption, a bad harvest, a trade slowdown, a military setback, threatened the entire structure. There was no margin left, no buffer. The system had become fragile. Then came the turning point that changed everything. Creditors stopped trusting promises. They wanted guarantees. Not words, but mechanisms. Oversight replaced faith. Foreign-controlled financial boards were imposed to ensure repayment. These bodies did not govern territory. They governed revenue. They monitored collection. They dictated allocation. Ottoman officials watched as income was tracked, redirected, and distributed under external supervision. Imagine ruling an empire but needing permission to spend its own money. That is not symbolism. That is a loss of sovereignty in practice. This was not an invasion. There were no soldiers marching to the capital. There were no flags raised. That is why it was so effective. Control arrived quietly, wrapped in administration. Debt enforcement does not require violence when compliance is built into the system. The empire still existed. Laws were still passed. Orders were still issued. But financial autonomy was gone. Wars accelerated the decline. Every conflict demanded immediate spending. Troops had to be mobilized. Supplies had to be purchased. Logistics had to be maintained. War does not wait for budgets to recover. Each campaign forced new borrowing. Each defeat reduced revenue. Territory loss meant taxes lost. Trade disrupted meant customs weakened. The math became brutal. Spend more. Earn less. Borrow again. Debt did what armies could not. It narrowed choices. Military defeat is temporary if recovery is possible. Financial defeat removes that option. When rebellion spread or rivals advanced, the empire could not respond freely. Every decision carried financial consequences, overseen by others. Retrenchment weakened authority. Aggression risked insolvency. Delay invited collapse. There was no winning move left. It is important to understand what this was not. It was not simply corruption. It was not just mismanagement. Those existed, but they were not decisive. The core mechanism was leverage. Creditors did not need to rule the empire. They needed to shape its constraints. Debt turned economic weakness into political influence. Influence into compliance. Compliance into control. The empire still appeared on maps. It still negotiated treaties. It still issued laws. But internally, it was operating under conditions it did not set. Revenue priorities were fixed externally. Long-term planning became impossible. Reform required investment, but investment required approval. Innovation slowed. The state became reactive, not strategic. This erosion changed the psychology of governance. Officials no longer asked what was best for the empire. They asked what was affordable under existing obligations. Vision shrank. Survival dominated. The future was no longer shaped. It was postponed. That mindset is deadly for large systems. Empires require flexibility. Debt removes it. Meanwhile, global power continued to shift. Industrial economies expanded. Financial centers grew more sophisticated. Capital became more concentrated. The Ottoman Empire fell further behind with each cycle. The gap was no longer just technological or military. It was structural. The empire could not mobilize resources at scale without external permission. That alone determined outcomes. Think about the asymmetry this created. European powers could plan decades ahead, financed by growing capital markets. The Ottomans planned year to year, constrained by repayment schedules. One side could absorb shocks. The other could not. One side could take risks. The other could only manage decline. By this stage, collapse was no longer a possibility. It was a trajectory. The empire could survive individual crises, but not the system that produced them. Debt ensured that each recovery was weaker than the last, each reform more constrained, each war more damaging. Once financial independence was lost, political collapse became a matter of timing. The state no longer controlled the mechanisms that sustain power. Authority without resources is temporary. Legitimacy without capacity fades. The Ottoman Empire had crossed that line. The final decades would bring wars, revolts, and external pressure. Those events would be remembered as causes. But they were accelerants, not origins. The origin lay in the moment debt stopped being a tool and became a master. The empire was still standing, but its economic heart no longer belonged to it. And when an empire loses control of its own heartbeat, the body eventually follows. By the time the Ottoman Empire finally collapsed, it felt sudden only to those who had not been watching the numbers. On the surface, events moved fast. Wars erupted. Borders dissolved. New flags appeared almost overnight. But beneath that speed was a long, slow decay that had already hollowed the state. The collapse was not a shock. It was the last step in a process decades in motion. Debt had done its work patiently. When the final pressures arrived, there was nothing left to absorb them. The empire entered its last phase exhausted, financially constrained, administratively brittle. Years of external oversight had weakened internal authority. Institutions still existed, but they no longer commanded confidence or resources. When global war erupted and nationalist movements surged, the Ottoman state lacked the flexibility to respond. It could not mobilize funds quickly. It could not stabilize regions through investment. It could not buy loyalty where legitimacy had eroded. The system had lost its shock absorbers. War accelerated everything. Conflict demands excess capacity. It demands reserves, credit, and the ability to redirect resources rapidly. The Ottoman Empire had none of that left. Revenue streams were already pledged. Borrowing options were exhausted or politically conditioned. Each military loss reduced income further. Each retreat weakened administrative reach. Collapse fed on itself. Nationalist movements that had once been manageable now gained momentum. The state could not co-opt them with reforms or investment. It could not suppress them decisively without resources. Authority fractured region by region. What had once been a centralized imperial system broke into competing centers of power. The empire did not fall in one moment. It fragmented. Foreign influence filled the vacuum, not because outsiders were uniquely aggressive, but because the financial groundwork had already been laid. Control followed money. Territories were reorganized under new mandates. Borders were drawn that reflected strategic and economic interests as much as history or culture. The political map changed quickly, but the financial logic behind it was familiar. The empire's debt outlived the empire itself. This is one of the most overlooked aspects of the Ottoman collapse. The end of imperial rule did not mean the end of obligations. Financial commitments carried forward into successor states. Economic dependencies persisted even as flags changed. Control did not disappear. It was redistributed. The legacy of debt-shaped governance long after the empire was gone. To many observers, the Ottoman Empire's fall looked inevitable. Old empires fall. New nations rise. History moves on. But inevitability is a dangerous illusion. The collapse was not written into geography or culture. It was produced by structural weakness, specifically by the loss of financial independence. Once the state could no longer control its own revenue, it could no longer control outcomes. Think about that. The empire still had land. It still had people. It still had history and legitimacy. What it lacked was room to maneuver. Debt had narrowed the future until there were no good options left. When crisis arrived, collapse was simply the only remaining path. This is why the story matters beyond its time. The Ottoman Empire is often remembered as a political failure or a military anachronism. But at its core, this was an economic story. Money moved faster than institutions could adapt. Credit reshaped power without visible conquest. Debt transferred control quietly, legally, and efficiently. Modern states face the same temptation. Borrow to stabilize. Borrow to grow. Borrow to delay hard choices. In many cases, borrowing works. Until it does not. Debt itself is not the villain. Dependence is. The moment survival depends on external financing. Autonomy begins to erode. Slowly at first. Then all at once. The Ottoman experience shows how difficult that erosion is to recognize in real time. Decline did not feel like decline. It felt like management. Like compromise. Like necessary adjustment. Each decision made sense in isolation. Together, they close off the future. Empires do not always fall to enemies. Sometimes they fall to math. Interest rates. Repayment schedules. Conditional credit. The tools are quiet. The consequences are not. When the Ottoman Empire finally disappeared from the map, the world explained it through war and nationalism. Those forces were real. But they were enabled by something deeper. A state that cannot control its money cannot control its destiny. Once that truth took hold, collapse was no longer avoidable. Only delayed. And delay, financed by debt, is the most expensive strategy of all. If you want to understand how power really shifts in history, follow the money. If you found this story valuable, subscribe for more deep, cinematic explorations of history and economics, and share with others who want to see how empires truly rise and fall.